Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining us today because we are diving into something absolutely huge. We're exploring the true foundation of stability. And honestly, this is a topic that literally touches every single part of our lives, from the vibe in our own living rooms to the overall health of our entire society.
So let me just ask you a question, and it's one you've probably felt the weight of at some point in your life. Does personal freedom actually destroy society? I mean, it's that classic, universally recognized tension, right? On one hand, you've got your own personal goals, your passions, your unique path in life. But on the other hand, you have these deep familial and societal obligations. So are these two things just inherently at odds with one another?
Well, for centuries, philosophers and sociologists have basically been stuck in this giant tug-of-war over this exact issue. The working assumption for a really long time has been that individual liberty and collective stability are just opposing forces. The big fear is that if we overemphasize personal freedom, it's inevitably going to lead to social fragmentation, atomization, and basically the breakdown of vital institutions, like the family.
Okay, so let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The freedom versus order myth. 2. Redefining true autonomy. 3. Designing happy families. 4. Building a stable society. And finally, 5. The power of relational freedom.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the freedom versus order myth. Now, before we can really build a new understanding, we've got to dismantle that old way of thinking. The one that constantly pits our individual desires against communal harmony. The traditional view tells us that individual desires are a total threat. But the HC framework, which by the way stands for the Harmonious Coexistence Framework, completely flips the script here. It asserts that individual autonomy actually creates cohesive stability. It tells us that fostering personal agency and self-actualization isn't a threat to order, it is literally the very foundation of it.
Moving right along to Section 2, redefining true autonomy.
To really grasp how this framework operates, we first need to get super clear on what we actually mean by autonomy, just to make sure we're all on the exact same page. In the HOC framework, autonomy doesn't mean being a lone wolf. We are not talking about radical isolationism here. Rather, it's defined as the capacity to make genuine, self-directed choices while remaining fully cognizant of your social environment. So think of it as this perfect blend of self-direction paired with acute social awareness. And this redefinition really rests on three core pillars. First up, self-determination and competence. When you're actually empowered to chart your own educational or professional path, you develop a much higher internal locus of control. You just feel more competent. Second is intrinsic motivation. Think about it. When you're forced to do a chore versus when you eagerly choose to organize your own space, that is the difference intrinsic motivation makes. When your choices are driven by internal alignment instead of coercion, you experience way lower levels of alienation and resentment. And third, accountability. True autonomy cannot exist in a vacuum. Because you value your own freedom, it inherently demands that you respect the equal autonomy of others. Bottom line, personal freedom absolutely requires personal responsibility.
All right, that brings us to Section 3, Designing Happy Families.
Let's take all this high-level sociology and bring it right down to the relatable, emotional sphere of our own homes. Historically, family structures function through these rigid hierarchies that suppressed individual expression just to keep the unit together. But, as our source material notes, resentment often breeds when individuals feel forced to sacrifice their core identity for familial expectations. Makes sense, right? Well, the HAC framework totally eliminates this friction. It reconceptualizes the family as a collaborative ecosystem. Allowing family members to pursue their authentic identities is actually what leads to long-term marital and familial happiness. You bring a fulfilled, well-rounded version of yourself into the home, which replaces rigid obligation with authentic connection. And you can imagine how profoundly this impacts the way we raise the next generation. By respecting early decision-making, we naturally validate a child's need for independence. And because they don't have to constantly fight you for basic agency, behavioral rebellion actually drops significantly. Ultimately, this step-by-step path helps them grow into emotionally secure adults who can maintain stable relationships of their own, which perpetuates this really beautiful cycle of domestic harmony.
For adults, this framework translates into equitable partnerships. So instead of relationships being held together by, say, economic or social entrapment, they're sustained by continuous choice, communication, and empathy. When you consciously choose your partner every single day because you want to, not because you're forced to, it cultivates much deeper and exponentially more resilient bonds.
Let's move on and see how this builds in Section 4, building a stable society.
So, zooming back out to the macro level,
let's look at how a collection of these autonomous individuals impacts society as a whole. Authoritarian, top-down control might look totally orderly on the surface, but it maintains peace through coerced compliance, and that makes it incredibly fragile. On the flip side, voluntary cooperation is bottom-up and deeply resilient. When citizens feel respected and free, their allegiance to their social structures is completely authentic. Social stability is always, without a doubt, most resilient when it's built from the bottom up. And the societal benefits of this, they're massive. First off, civic engagement and trust. Autonomous individuals naturally participate in civic life because they actually believe their actions can affect change. This builds interpersonal trust, which is pretty much the operational glue of any stable community. Second, adaptability and innovation. To survive economic and cultural shifts, a society can't just be rigid, it has to be dynamic. Autonomy encourages the exact kind of critical thinking, creativity, and entrepreneurship necessary to adapt constructively to crises, rather than just fracturing under rigid dogmas.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the power of relational freedom.
Now, it's super important that we actively address the critics and the most common counterarguments against prioritizing individual freedom. The big one you hear all the time is this: but what about pure selfishness and hyper-individualism? And hey, it's a totally valid concern. Critics argue that prioritizing autonomy is just going to create a society of disconnected citizens with zero loyalty to the common good, leading to people neglecting their communal duties and totally refusing to compromise.
So, the crucial point here is exactly how the HC framework responds to this critique. It explicitly rejects absolute, atomistic individualism. Instead, it introduces this concept of relational autonomy. What that means is that an individual's freedom is actually deeply intertwined with the well-being of their community and family. True autonomy doesn't mean being selfish. It actually includes the capacity for empathy, moral duty, and cooperative sacrifice. And that leads us perfectly to the idea of cooperative sacrifice. People in this framework absolutely still sacrifice for their families and compromise for their communities, but the mechanism is completely different. They choose to contribute precisely because they are free to genuinely recognize and value those bonds. It's a willing gift, rather than a toll that's being extracted from them.
Ultimately, as our source points out so beautifully, people thrive best when they are trusted. When societal structures and family units actively protect personal agency, they unlock this incredible reservoir of trust, innovation, and enduring happiness that rigid conformity simply can never, ever achieve.
I want to leave you with this final provocative question to chew on. Are your relationships and institutions built on rigid coercion or the empowering foundation of true autonomy? Take a second to look at your own life dynamics through the lens of the HC framework. I really hope this explainer has given you a fresh perspective on the true foundation of stability and leaves you eager to foster a little more relational freedom in your own world. Thanks so much for learning with me today.